Welcome to all of you from me as well. I'm really grateful to Riza who agreed to host this precisely because it's the philosophy department, and I think for those of you who know me, I'm very much interested in this question of how we conceive of philosophy as we move forward, and particularly how we engage with traditions which may not always be seen as philosophical, but certainly within their context are seen as either philosophically significant or at least philosophically adjacent. And it forces us to think about, taking arguments, taking thought experiments, taking particular ways of approaching questions seriously in a broader philosophical sense. Who are we? Are we selves? Are we persons? Where do we come from? What's the nature of the reality that we inhabit, and so forth? How do we engage with each other? What sort of ethical norms might guide that activity? There's so many sorts of questions that we ask, which are very much part of different kinds of cultural and religious traditions, and that's significant. That allows an opening for different kinds of conversations, and I'm really grateful that we have a space to do precisely this, and hope we can do more in the future. Now, on the topic of today's workshop, Ibn Arabi, it's an interesting starting point, I think, for SRI. It's probably a controversial starting point, but I think it's a really interesting one, because if you ask people in the contemporary sort of Shi'i world about Ibn Arabi, then things range from Ayatollah Khomeini's famous exhortation to Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, to read Ibn Arabi because this was the most important in many ways expression of ideas within Islam, all the way through to those who would kind of vilify him and say that he's the worst thing that ever happened. He's the Akfar al-Nas, Mumit al-Din, and all this sort of stuff that is part of the polemics, which we will actually hear about later in the day as well. So there's that kind of polarization on it. But what's really important, of course, is that Ibn Arabi, if anyone is interested in the course of intellectual history in Islam, Ibn Arabi is probably the most important figure. It's maybe a toss-up between Avicenna and Ibn Arabi, but I actually think Ibn Arabi is more important. And as time goes on, it is clearly demonstrated, especially in what we tend to call the Persianate East, where this is clearer. And of course, as part of that significant kind of influence, there were ways in which Ibn Arabi was blended with Avicenna. Famously happened in many cases in India in particular, and of course in Iran, but also with other modes of thought, whether it was part of the Shi'i theological and devotional and mystical tradition, or other kinds of traditions. Recently I've kind of become fascinated with what's happening in China in the early modern period, and the dominant paradigm of Muslim intellectual production is a blending together of Ibn Arabi and Neo-Confucianism, which is a really significant development. And it actually allows us to think about what sort of entry we have into considering the nature of Chinese thought and how we incorporate it within the wider remit of Islamic intellectual history. So I personally think Ibn Arabi needs no justification in that sense. And I think there should be a debate, a serious debate. It's perfectly reasonable for people to say, we don't like Ibn Arabi for these reasons, and that's happened in history. Or we think that there are compatibilities here, or we think there aren't compatibilities here in terms of the metaphysics. I think it's a good starting point. I hope that in future we will have maybe something on Avicenna in the Shi'i tradition. Even things like which fundamentally, for me a fundamental question is there such a thing as Shi'i metaphysics? Is it a concept which actually makes sense? Do these sort of qualifications, Islamic metaphysics, Shi'i metaphysics, make sense? Or should we be rethinking what do we mean by metaphysics as such, which then allows us to bring in different kinds of perspectives? And on the way here, I was reading Jay Garfield's recent book on no self, which brings together, various aspects of Buddhist thought, of Hume. We're all familiar with Hume's bundle theory. There's no such thing as a self because we're just a bundle of experiences and features. And also bringing in aspects from neuroscience and so forth. So I think as we move forward, the really exciting thing in philosophy and the study of humanities is going to be deciding on what are the questions we want to ask and how we approach them, not necessarily staying within the silos of our traditions, but actually really wanting to engage and go beyond those traditions. And for me, that's why I think the humanities is such an exciting space to be. And it's an exciting space to be because we have a commitment to what it means to be human, and we have a commitment to understanding what humanity is, and we have I'll stop at this point. We have a commitment to understanding the world in which we live, which means that these conversations are not just abstract conversations, but they are very much embedded in our experiences of what our students are going through. Those of you at U of T, same as us, we have student encampments about Palestine, about what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank. And those kind of what are often called political engagements are also part of our broader sense of what we think our commitment as academics is. I think it's important we're not just people having siloed conversations, but we're actually trying to, as Marx famously said, we're trying to change the world. We're not just trying to have conversations. So I'll stop at that. I can kind of pontificate and preach for ages on this sort of thing, but thank you all for coming. Thank you to all the speakers who will be speaking and for the organizers. We'll make a start. I realize we're slightly behind, but I will hand the floor over to Professor Sajjad, who is by far the best speaker apart from Professor Lawson that I've ever heard. And so we will start with the best. And so please, Cyrus.